Hello, my name is Florian. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Erfurt, and the talk today is based on a book that is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press called Colonial Internationalism and the Governmentality of Empire. And I would like to thank the organizers very much to give me the opportunity to discuss new ideas that developed from that in this conference. I would also like to thank people who put this excellent panel together, and I will start right away. For most of the 20th century, colonial history has been little more than a variety of national and nationalist history. In the 20th century, most publications about colonial history were, and partly still are in the 21st century, about French colonial history, British colonial history, German colonial history. This approach, I argue in this paper, was misleading in at least two ways. First, this nation-centered approach conceptually excluded and ignored the agency of those who lived in these empires, but did not consider themselves as French, British, German, and Belgian, or who were denied access to citizenship of these countries. Second, seen from the global south, colonialism was not as fragmented as Europeans like to think, but a joint European and even Western project. Several historians have shown that in the last years, and the most eloquent voice to blame Europeans of pursuing a common colonial cause was probably Aimé Césaire, who already wrote in his 1915 discourse on colonialism that the nationalist narrative of European fragmentation that seemed to have materialized in two world wars did not necessarily exist. At least it did not exist in the eyes of the colonized people of the world. So Césaire famously claimed that Hitler and Schumann were both colonialists, even though the illiberal Hitler started World War II and the liberal Schumann pushed toward the creation of the European community. According to Césaire, the difference between Hitler's anti-European ethno-nationalism and Schumann's pan-European internationalism faded when it came to colonialism, and when they showed their racist attitude toward people from the global south, that was pretty much the same in both cases. Thus, colonialism made Europeans look alike, even if they thought of themselves as politically at opposite ends or as citizens of two different nations, such as Germany and France, that seem to be rivals, that even become hereditary enemies, as they called it in the early 20th century. So post-colonial thinkers such as Césaire questioned the myth of competitive difference between Europeans. I argue in this paper that he was right with regard to colonialism, as it was a joint European project, and empires cooperated to keep the colonial project alive. I will illustrate how this, what I call, trans-imperial dimension of European colonialism emerged by shortly outlining the history of the Institut Colonial International, International Colonial Institute. The institute was established by a French colonial activist, Joseph Chaibert, in 1893, and he tried to bring together colonial activists from around Europe. This institute became a highly successful institution and existed until 1982. In between, in 1949, it changed its name from Institut Colonial International to Institut International des Civilisations Différentes, International Institute of Differing Civilizations. I came across the Institut Colonial International when doing research on Franco-German colonial cooperation during the so-called Morocco crisis in 1911. By then, the Institut Colonial International was one of the biggest international institutions, with 200 members recruited among the most important colonial experts from 13 countries, mainly in Europe. The entire French Parti colonial joined this institute. Among the earliest members was French colonial theorist Paul Leroy-Beaulieu. The founder was, as I said, Joseph Jaibert, also the lawyer Arthur Giraud, and the colonial lawyer Arthur Giraud joined, the resident general of Morocco, Hubert Lyautey, the ship owner from Marseille, Jules Charles Leroux, and the leader of the Algerian settler lobby, Eugène Etienne, and many others. In the interwar period, even more people joined the institute. And also after 1945, when it was renamed Institut des Civilisations Différentes, the French group, or maybe it's more correct to talk about the group from the Union Française, which was founded at this time, remained one of the biggest groups in the Institut Colonial International. When I started doing research on this institute in 2007, I realized that it was literally unknown. Only a handful of historians had mentioned it en passant, and archivists who held the papers of the institute heard of it for the first time. Most archivists were familiar with the new name, Institut des Civilisations Différentes, but they did not know that it used to be the Institut Colonial International before 1945. So with its original name, the memory of the institute and its trans-imperial interaction sort of got lost. This is also surprising because quite important people joined the Institut Colonial International, but also later on the Institut des Civilisations Différentes, such as Georges Palandier, who was one of the most pertinent experts, as you might know, of colonial history, anthropology, and sociology, who joined the institute in the 1950s and made extensive use of the accumulated knowledge in the institute to develop his famous analysis of the situation coloniale. He could do that because between 1893 and 1945, the institute has published over 150 comparative studies on colonialism. It developed strategies of government and exploitations of the colonies, and the members cooperated in fields such as labor recruitment, tropical hygiene, railway building, mining, the codification of customary and Islamic law, and also very early development projects, joint international development projects. After 1950, the institute tried to square the circle of making people forget about its colonial past by renaming it, while similarly building on its past by portraying themselves as experts on the so-called underdeveloped world that obviously used to be the colonial world, or still was the colonial world. By then, in the 1950s, it accepted members from the Global South for the first time. And like that, the Institute was quite successful in burying its colonial past in oblivion. Soon after the independence era in the 1960s, a general colonial amnesia helped the Institute to redefine its formerly colonial projects as humanitarian projects. And from the 1960s onwards, it cooperated closely with international development agencies such as ECOSOC and UNESCO. Another probably more important reason why the Institute escaped the attention of the historians in the 1960s, or from the 1960s onwards, was that it hardly fit the historiographical categories of analysis that dominated the 20th century. First, it was not tied to a certain place or nation. Also, its papers are scattered over different archives around Europe, so you don't have the one national archives that contains the papers of the Institute. And although its administrative office was based in Brussels, The institute held annual meetings in different cities all over Europe. Every year it voted a new president from another country. Funding came from different European governments, also from colonial administrations, from corporate companies and private persons. So the Institute was also not only an international organization, but predominantly a transimperial institution. And the word transimperial did not exist until recently in the historian's analytic toolbox. So historians had some experience in analyzing international organizations of the 19th century, of course, of the 20th century, such as the League of Nations and the UN. But the Transimperial Institut Colonial International was more than a typical international learned society of the 19th century, for example. It was closer to practice and developed an applied science of colonial government. And the influence of the colonized people on the colonial schemes of the Institut Colonial International were also quite significant. But since European and Eurocentric historians were hardly interested in indigenous agency, they failed to ask for their contribution that also made the history of this institute. So all in all, the institute neither fitted into the nationalist narratives nor into those of international history that was mostly Eurocentric and completely forgot about the Institut Colonial International. It was therefore absent from histories of both nationalism and internationalism. For these structural reasons, one might argue historians contributed little to the history of the institution that actually shaped colonial policy around the world for over 7 decades and is now absent in official and cultural memory. So we might ask what the meaning of the Institute is for French and international history or European history. As I mentioned above, the French coloniaux established the Institut Colonial International in the 1890s. It seems like they had a particular interest in transimperial exchange. Joseph Jaibert, in particular, initiated the Institute to learn from German, British, and especially Dutch colonizers about, for example, more profitable ways of colonizing. If historians claim that French colonial theory has been developed by, I don't know, Gallieni in Madagascar, Lyautey in Morocco, or even by the Algerian settler lobby, they widely ignored the trans-imperial exchange of ideas and technologies also between the members of this institute that shaped French colonial theory and practice. Those who joined this International Colonial Institute didn't never free themselves completely of nationalism, but they successfully avoided nationalist confrontation within the meetings, inside when they met, and also in their writings. So they often understood themselves not as nationalists representing a country, but as colonialists representing a common cause, and developed a particular colonial esprit de corps. So, for example, in 1907, a French member of the Institute, Albert de Pouvourville, wrote in a German colonial newspaper that, I quote, and he's talking about Germany and France now, I quote, "We, the friends of colonial expansion in Germany and France, shall cherish one ideal that we found on the journeys we have made, at the remote places we have seen, and during the strenuous and adventurous lives we have led. We should cherish that ideal among all people and in all the different climes. This ideal is certainly not more beautiful than the nationalist thought, but it complements it in the most useful and human way. It is the European ideal." End of quote. So why Pouvourville here is paying lip service to nationalism, or still highlights nationalism as an interesting thought, as he called it, he definitely celebrates and highlights the more noble European ideal. But obviously the European ideal was not a pure one. what actually made the French coloniaux in particular support such a trans-imperial fraternization? So French trans-imperial theory and practice, I think, had already existed in the 19th century. Obviously, avant la lettre, the word didn't exist, but there are phenomena that can be described as trans-imperial. In the 19th century, French colonialists, for example, had assumed leadership in the Pan-Latinist movement and partly realized their colonial dreams of a Latin America and a Latin Africa. Pan-Latinism, though it was mostly a means to the end of French cultural imperialism and helped to establish the French grandeur in the world. This was slightly different when the Institut Colonial International met for the first time in 1893, because France was not the leader of the institute or French participants, but they faced other mostly superior powers in the institute, such as Germany, Britain, and partly the Netherlands. Thus, at the first meeting in 1893, the French delegates were really surprised that they were able to successfully cooperate with what they called Germanic and Anglo-Saxon colonizers. So unlike in the Pan-Latinist movement of the 19th century, French members did not join the Institut Colonial International to institutionalize their cultural imperialism. And interestingly, while Pan-Latinism received much attention in the historiography, in French historiography, the trans-imperial cooperation beyond Pan-Latinism was rarely mentioned, probably also because Pan-Latinism sort of re-emerged in the post-colonial concept of the francophonie. Hence, the Institute's trans-imperial project in the end became less known than the Pan-Latinist project, for example. So the absence of this trans-imperial cooperation in the European historiography of the 20th century is striking, not only with regard to the Institut Colonial International. For example, historians rarely mention that the celebration on occasion of the centenaire of Algeria's conquest in 1931 and the colonial exhibition that accompanied it was indeed an international event called Exposition Coloniale Internationale. And the centenaire became predominantly known as a nationalist lieu de mémoire for France, but it was also an international one, and many of the members of the Institut Colonial International from abroad came to celebrate Algeria's conquest as a common European achievement. At the same time, Jailly explicitly established the Institut Colonial International, and that is a sort of a different story, because he anticipated memory wars about the character of French colonialism. He thought of the Institut Colonial International in the 1890s as a future competing lieu de mémoire that dissociated French colonialism from the bad reputation of settler colonialism in Algeria that existed already in the 1890s. To understand this anti-Algerian stance of Jailly as the founder of the Institute, we have to analyze his reasons why he initiated this trans-imperial project. Jailly was the son-in-law of Paul Bert, a famous colonial administrator who had introduced allegedly progressive colonial methods in Indochina. Jailly wanted to make a similar career in the French colonial service, but felt ousted by the Algerian settler lobby that dominated the Parti colonial and colonial discourse in France. So as a reaction against this hegemony, Jailly established the Institut Colonial International, hoping it might help him to end the hegemony of the Algerian settler lobby, whose colonization schemes Jailly described as backward, destructive, and costly. So first he was feeling offended by the Algerian settler lobby, but then he took the debate and the conflict with them to a more abstract level and styled his conflict with the Algerian settler lobby um, as a battle over the very character of French colonialism that opposed nationalist settler colonialism in Algeria to an allegedly liberal and trans-imperial colonialism that used methods, for example, of indirect rule as represented by the British and the Dutch empires. So while Jaibert dismissed the nationalist project of assimilating Algeria to the French nation by colonizing it with French settlers, he endorsed French participation in a trans-imperial colonial project that used progressive methods such as indirect rule. And by establishing the Institut Colonial International, he created a potential anti-Algerian settler lieu de mémoire. No doubt, Jailly's overall purpose was to give French colonialism a good name, to turn French colonialism into a lieu de mémoire that evoked a constructive and more liberal colonialism. Obviously, turning against the Algerian model meant that he also turned about the Republican myth of assimilation. Historians spoke a lot about that. But Jailly favored the allegedly British and Dutch method of liberal indirect rule. In the long term, Jailly seems to have failed in establishing a lieu de mémoire of an allegedly progressive trans-imperial colonialism by highlighting the role especially of the Institut Colonial International in France. Yet the impression of failure is rather due to a much later period when French historiography in the mid-19th century sort of lost the knowledge about this trans-imperial colonialism in the Institut Colonial International and in other organizations. So the history of French colonialism up to the 1950s shows that trans-imperialism indeed shaped French colonial ideology and practice. As I said, the centenaire of the conquest of Algeria in 1931 was this trans-imperial event that was accompanied by this Exposition Coloniale Internationale and was explicitly international. Then, of course, the French participation in the League of Nations and the Mandate administration was also sort of first international institutionalization of trans-imperial cooperation. And also after 1945, when the possessions in Outre-mer became part of France, French colonial experts made sure that the emerging European community also associated its African territories in the Treaty of Rome in 1955, thus creating the famous Eurafrica. And historians also have ignored the Eurafrican project for a long time. Although this Eurafrican economic community also stood for what Jailly already introduced as this idea of trans-imperial liberalization of imperial rule. And of course, people reacted to these trans-imperial projects in which France was very much involved. Aimé Césaire, whom I quoted in the beginning, and who wrote in his discourse on colonialism at the very moment when the Euro-African project came into being, it was very aware of the hypocrisy of these French statesmen who claimed to introduce liberalized and trans-imperialized Euro-Africa, especially by promoting the Union Française and the Euro-African community. So it was Césaire who rightly remarked in the 1950s, and that's what I said in the beginning, that colonialism can never be liberalized, and certainly not by trans-imperializing it as the Institut Colonial International, the League of Nations, or the Euro-Africa project tried to do. So it was not until the 1970s, more or less, that trans-imperial mindsets and colonial internationalism disappeared from French public discourse. Probably the Algerian War and the role it played as a national trauma played a role in that, and we can discuss that later. And unlike in Britain, for example, the allegedly liberal colonialism never became a lieu de mémoire in France. Until the 21st century, historians ignored topics like the Institut Colonial International, the Euro-Africa project, also partly the League of Nations and its colonial transimperial activities. And only recently, in the early 2000s, these histories have been rediscovered and books have been published on them. So I will end on a rather speculative note by asking if the Institut Colonial International, and with it Transimperial History, might become a lieu de mémoire, and what kind of lieu de mémoire it might become in a European context, in a post-colonial context, and in the French context in particular. So this is rather speculative, but I'm quite confident that it will become a lieu de mémoire, given that decolonized movements, post-colonial activists, and also academic historians are already making European societies or the world aware of the trans-imperial dimension of colonialism. One example is in Berlin, where they recently opened a monument for the Transimperial Africa Conference in 1884-85 that was part of the scramble for Africa and basically ended it for the big powers to divide Africa among themselves. So this is one example. Another example for trans-imperial history in collective memory might be monuments about slavery and slave trade. But historians and also activists in decolonized movements and post-colonial movements are working on also this history of trans-imperial institutions such as the Institut Colonial International. So I think there are three different options for a lieu de mémoire. Of course, it can be a sort of European lieu de mémoire, showing that colonialism was a European project. And apart from that, there are, I think, two different options. Like, first of all, from a post-colonial perspective, unveiling the history of the Institut Colonial International might confirm the critique of Europe as a common colonial project that was highly destructive, no matter if it labeled itself as liberal or illiberal. Seen from, and that is the first option. So the post-colonial project can be confirmed by analyzing the Institut Colonial International. The second option might be that also from an apologetic point of view, a lieu de mémoire of French trans-imperiality might be used to legitimate and whitewash the colonial project, as Jaibert has intended it by portraying colonialism as a good thing, as a liberal thing, and as a trans-imperial thing. So, for example, the law of February 23, 2005 that prescribed to emphasize the positive role of colonialism seems to come very close to what Jaibert had in mind already in the 1890s to give sort of progressive image to colonialism via establishing the Institut Colonial International, and historians could sort of do the same thing to tell people how like international, open, colonialism was actually at that time. Of course, I think the second way of doing that is misleading. I think I'll leave it here and hope that this rather speculative and maybe a bit confusing note in the end can be a good start into discussing the topic. Thank you very much, and I'm looking very much forward to comments and questions.